War is a fertile ground for stories of heroism, tragedy, and sacrifice. But beyond the events documented in history books, there are those that defy logic, stories that refuse to fit within the boundaries of reason and reality. These are tales of apparitions, omens, and inexplicable signs that, in ways no one can understand, seem to alter the fate of soldiers. What do you do when a stopped watch marks the exact moment of an imminent attack? Or when footprints appear in the mud, leading an officer to essential supplies no one should have been able to find? Are these mere coincidences, hallucinations from war-weary minds? Or is there something more, an invisible presence watching over soldiers, guiding them to survival? In the devastated trenches of World War I, in the freezing darkness of shelters, men witnessed the impossible. Accounts like that of Lieutenant Richard Moore, saved by the watch of a fallen comrade, or Lieutenant Oliver Hayes, led by unseen footprints through the mud, force us to question the extent of the supernatural's influence on human fate. Whatever truly happened in those crucial moments, one thing is certain. In the chaos of war, sometimes the answers don't come from the living. My name is Richard Moore. Back then, I was a lieutenant in the British Army. But that night in Verdun, I was just a man trying to understand the impossible. War changes a man in ways he never imagined. At first, you think you can endure everything, the cold, the hunger, the stench of death. But then something happens, something that shatters everything you believe about life and death. Something that never leaves you. It was October 1916, and I was deep in the French trenches with my platoon. The rain hadn't stopped for days, turning the ground into a sea of thick mud. The smell of gunpowder and rotting flesh clung to my skin like an invisible plague. Verdun wasn't a battlefield. It was an open grave where the dead and the living blended into the darkness. That night, I walked through the trench checking on my men. Exhaustion was etched into their faces. There was no conversation, just the heavy silence of soldiers waiting for the next command. Then something caught my eye, a faint metallic glint, half buried in the mud beside one of the dugouts. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt with my rain-soaked hand. A pocket watch. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. I knew that watch. The silver finish, the short chain, and engraved on the back, a name that made my breath catch in my throat. Edward Harrington. My head spun. Edward was dead. A week earlier, we had received orders to advance on the enemy trenches. It was a massacre. Artillery, machine guns, screams. And in the middle of it all, Edward fell. I saw him get hit. I saw his body swallowed by the mud. There was no time to retrieve him. So how the hell was his watch here? My hands shook as I opened. The hands were frozen at 2:37. A chill ran down my spine. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone had found his body and brought the watch back. But why leave it on the ground? And why had no one told me? I clutched the watch tightly, feeling the cold metal press against my palm. It was just an object, right? Just a piece of metal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That night I dreamed of Edward, and he was watching me. If you ask any soldier who's spent enough time on the front lines, he'll tell you that war has its own way of playing tricks on a man's mind. The exhaustion, the constant fear, the sounds and the smells, it all starts to blend together. You see things, hear things. At least that's what they say. But that night what I saw wasn't some hallucination. I tried to sleep, God knows I tried. I curled up in a corner of the trench, gripping that damn pocket watch like it held some kind of answer. 02:37, the hands still frozen at the same moment in time. I closed my eyes, but sleep came in fragments. Shattered memories, distorted images shaped by exhaustion. Edward's face flashed through my mind, the last look he gave me before he fell. The muffled sound of gunfire mixed with the thunder of artillery, the metallic taste of fear on my tongue. Then I woke up. I didn't know why. Something pulled me from sleep, some deep instinct, the kind of feeling a soldier learns never to ignore. Everything around me was silent. Too silent. The rain was still falling, dripping onto the rotting wood of the barricades. The scent of mud and blood lingered in the air like it always did. My men were scattered throughout the trench, asleep, too drained to notice anything. But something was wrong, and then I saw him, Edward, standing on the other side of the trench, motionless, watching me. My blood turned to ice. My first reaction was to blink, to rub my eyes. But he was still there. He didn't look whole. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the dim light, covered in mud, his uniform torn exactly as it had been on the day he died. But what paralyzed me were his eyes, empty, sunken. As if they were looking straight through me, I tried to speak. I wanted to say his name, to ask if this was a dream, if I was losing my mind, but nothing came out. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed at the watch in my pocket. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to move, wanted to scream, wanted to do something, but my body refused to obey. And then, without a sound, without a single warning, he was gone, vanished into the darkness of the trench, as if he had never been there. Cold sweat dripped down my face. My fingers trembled as I pulled the watch from my pocket. 02:37. I spent the rest of the night awake, certain that at any moment he would return. By morning, I felt like a ghost. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. The image of Edward standing there pointing at me was burned into my mind like a rusted nail driven deep. The cold bit at my skin. But what really unsettled me was the watch in my hands. 02:37. Always that damn time. I opened it again, staring at the motionless hands. The silence around me felt heavier than ever. It took me a few minutes to work up the nerve to leave the shelter. When I finally stood, my muscles ached, my head throbbed. The stench of mud and blood felt stronger that day. As I walked through the trench, I looked for my men. Some were just waking up, others were already at their posts. I had to know. "Did anyone touch my things last night?" My voice came out harsher than I intended. The men exchanged puzzled glances. Carter, who slept closest to me, scratched his beard, still caked in mud, and shook his head. "No, sir, no one touched anything." I scanned their faces. They all had the same expression. No one knew anything about the watch. If no one put it there, then how did it appear? I stepped away without saying another word, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Was I losing my mind? The day dragged on. My body was there, but my mind was trapped in the events of the night before. The more I thought about it, the more I came to a single conclusion. 02:37 wasn't a coincidence. Edward hadn't appeared to haunt me. He was trying to tell me something. I needed to test it. As the sun began to set, I gathered the men. I ordered everyone to be armed and on full alert precisely at 02:30. Some grumbled, others looked confused. But no one questioned me. I only knew one thing. If Edward was warning me about something, I wasn't going to ignore it. That night, no one would sleep. The waiting was hell. Verdun's night was a bottomless pit of darkness. The cold clung to my skin like ice, but beneath the layers of mud and uniform, I was sweating. The tension weighed on us like an invisible force. No one spoke. No one moved. Unless necessary. 2:30. Silence stretched over the trench like a veil. The only sound was the light patter of rain against helmets and the cold metal of our weapons. My men were alert, but I could see it in their eyes. Doubt, frustration. They didn't understand why I had them standing guard at this specific hour, but I knew. I clutched Edward's watch in my pocket, feeling the cold metal against my sweaty palm. The hands frozen at 02:37. 5 minutes, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then they came. The sound was sudden. A metallic click, the muffled crunch of boots in the mud. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, and then hell opened up. A burst of gunfire tore through the air, bullets screaming over our heads. "Enemies!" someone shouted. They were close, too close. Dark shapes moved quickly, sliding. Through the soaked earth, the Germans had sent a stealth patrol, hoping to catch us asleep. If we had made the mistake of relaxing, we would have been slaughtered like dogs. But Edward warned me, and we were ready. "Fire!" I roared, and my men reacted instantly. The crack of rifles shattered the night. Muzzle flashes lit up the trench in brief bursts, revealing the tense faces of my soldiers and the silhouettes of enemies dropping one by one. The mud turned red. The stench of gunpowder and burning flesh filled the air. I spotted a German breaking off to the side, trying to escape. I fired before he could vanish into the dark. He dropped without a sound. My hands trembled as I reloaded. This wasn't skill, it wasn't luck, it was a warning. And then, silence returned. Bodies were scattered around us. The surviving enemies had fled back into the shadows, leaving their dead behind. My men were injured but alive. 2 had been grazed. Carter clutched his bleeding arm, but no one had died. If we had been sleeping, it would have been a massacre. The watch was still in my hand. 37, I took a deep breath, but the air felt heavier, thicker. Edward saved me, but why? What did he want? Why had he chosen me? I shoved the watch back into my pocket, staring up at the black sky. My body was drained, but my mind burned with questions. I couldn't answer. Edward was still here, and somehow this wasn't over. Edward's watch felt heavier in my pocket than it should have. The cold metal burned against my skin, a constant reminder of something I was trying to forget. But there, in that filthy trench, in the silence that followed battle, the memories came flooding back without warning. I had known Edward years before the war. We were friends, but also rivals. He was the kind of man who made everything seem effortless, strong, confident, with a grin that made you believe he had all the answers. From the early days of training, we competed in everything. Who ran faster? Who shot better? Who earned more respect from the officers? I hated losing to him, but at the same time, I respected him more than any man I had ever met. The watch now buried in my pocket had always been with him, a gift from his father, a military veteran who had served in Afghanistan. "This watch saved my life once," Edward used to say, spinning the chain between his fingers. "Maybe one day it'll save mine again." I never understood what he meant by that, not until the day I lost him. We were sent on a suicide mission, a charge against a heavily fortified German position. I knew it was a terrible idea, but orders were orders. The advance was doomed from the start. The Germans opened fire before we could react. Men dropped all around me, swallowed by mud and blood. And me. I hesitated. For a second, just 1 second, I froze. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, but my legs refused to obey. Edward saw it. "Richard, move!" he shouted. But I was still locked in place, and so he did the only thing he could. He moved for me. He covered our retreat, pulled another soldier out of the line of fire, and then the shot came. I heard the impact before I saw him fall. His blood mixed with the mud, and in that moment, I knew. He wasn't getting up. I wanted to run to him, but everything was collapsing, explosions, screams, chaos. The last thing I saw was Edward lying in the cold dirt, his eyes open but empty. I never forgave him for saving me, and I never forgave myself for letting him die. Now the watch was here, and so was Edward, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done with me yet. The next day passed in a blur. I didn't speak about what had happened the night before. Who would believe me, even if I told the truth, that the ghost of Edward Harrington had appeared and saved my life? My men would think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, but the watch said otherwise. I opened it over and over throughout the day, hoping the hands had moved, that everything had gone back to normal. But they remained frozen at 2:37, a silent reminder of what had happened at that exact moment. When night fell, the fear returned. I wanted to ignore it, to believe it had all been some trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew Edward would return, and I was right. 15. I woke up suddenly, as if someone had whispered my name. The trench was swallowed in darkness. The rain had stopped and everything was too quiet. My eyes scanned the shelter. The men were asleep, breathing heavily, exhausted from the last battle. But something felt off. I could sense it. And then, he was there. Edward, standing in the same place where I had seen him before. But now, he looked different. The first time he had been pale, covered in mud, but still Edward. Now his face was darker, his eyes even more hollow. His torn uniform looked filthier, more worn. It was as if he were fading. But the worst part was his expression. It wasn't just empty, it was desperate. My chest tightened. I wanted to ask him something, to say anything. But my throat was dry. He raised his hand again. I already knew what he wanted. With trembling fingers, I pulled the watch from my pocket and flipped it open. The hands had moved. Now they pointed to 03:15. I looked up to face Edward, but he was already gone. The war wasn't over for him, and maybe it wasn't over for me either. This time I didn't hesitate. The night before, I had ignored the signs until it was almost too late. But now I knew what was coming. The watch didn't lie. 03:15. If Edward had returned to warn me, it meant something was about to happen, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake. At 02:45, I woke my men. Positions now! They were exhausted. I could see the doubt and fatigue on their faces, but no one questioned me. We had already survived the impossible once. They trusted me, even if they didn't know my order came from a ghost. Carter adjusted his helmet as he stepped closer. "You sure about this, Lieutenant?" I wasn't, but I couldn't show it. "Yes, trust me." He nodded and disappeared into the darkness, gathering the others. Within minutes, everyone was armed and spread out along the trench. The silence was suffocating. Only the steady breathing of soldiers and the muffled squelch of mud beneath our boots filled the air. I checked the watch in my pocket. 03:10, the seconds dragged. My chest felt like lead. A thought crept into my mind. What if nothing happens? What if I was wrong? But then, 03:15 arrived. The first gunshot shattered the silence, and then all hell broke loose. A storm of machine gun fire tore through the trench, kicking up dirt and blood. The Germans came with everything they had. This wasn't just a patrol trying to catch us off guard. This was a full-scale attack, screams, explosions, mud and smoke. We fought back immediately. They weren't expecting us to be awake. We fired into the charging shadows, cutting them down before they could reach us. I shot without thinking, reloaded without thinking. I just fought. Then I saw him, between the flashes of explosions, among the figures running and falling. Edward was there, standing still, watching. His eyes were no longer empty. There was no pain, no fear. For the first time since he returned, he looked at peace. He locked eyes with me, and for a brief moment, everything disappeared. The noise, the screams, the war. Nothing existed except that 1 second. Then he nodded, a simple gesture. Almost imperceptible, and he was gone. Just like that, he vanished into the smoke of battle. The sun began to rise soon after. The Germans had retreated, leaving their dead scattered across the field. I leaned against the trench wall, exhausted. The watch was still in my hand. I looked at it. The hands had started moving again. The war was over for Edward. But for me, it never really ended. The war didn't stop that night, but Edward did. When the sun broke through the gray sky that morning, casting its cold light over the horror around us, I knew he was gone. The bodies of fallen Germans lay scattered across the muddy field, mixed with our own. More dead, more blood, more ghosts. The survivors in my platoon were drained, hollowed out, but alive. Some were tending to wounds, others just sat there, staring into nothing. Carter walked up to me, pressing a blood-stained cloth against his arm. He had the same look as always, not of victory, but of someone who had survived by sheer chance. "We made it, sir." I nodded but didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. I stepped away from the trench, feeling a strange weight on my shoulders. Something had shifted. The air felt different, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. That's when my hand brushed against my pocket. The watch. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me was afraid to look, afraid of what I might see. But I knew I had to. With unsteady fingers, I pulled the cold metal object from my pocket and pressed the latch. And there it was. The hands had moved. My breath caught. 0237 was in the past. The watch now read EO346. I let out a slow breath. Edward was gone. I don't know how long. I stood there, staring at the watch as if it might give me answers. It wouldn't. But somehow I understood anyway. Edward had been trapped in that moment, in that war, until he did what he needed to do. Now, he was free. I closed the watch and held it tight before slipping it back into my pocket. For the first time, it didn't feel so heavy. Days later, we received new orders. Move forward. High Command didn't care how many bodies we left behind, how many souls still wandered those fields. The war moved on, and so did I. But something inside me had changed. I used to carry guilt. Now, I carried Edward. The watch never stopped again. Each tick reminded me of him. Our rivalry, our conversations, the last look we shared. How he saved me twice. And I knew that when this war finally ended and I made it home, the watch would still be with me. Edward would still be with me. But for now, I was still trapped here. I sighed, clenched the watch in my pocket, and turned back toward my... The war didn't wait for anyone. I've seen things I wish I could forget. Things that creep back into nightmares, lurk in the silence that stretches too long, or make my heart race at the sound of old wood creaking, convincing me for just a second that I'm back there again. But what happened that morning, that haunts me in a different way, because even now, it still doesn't make sense. It was 1917 Northern France. I was Lieutenant Oliver Hayes, leading a small group of British soldiers in the trenches. That night had been hell. The shelling started around midnight and didn't stop until the sky was already turning gray. Hours and hours of explosions, screams, and the ground shaking like hell itself was clawing its way to the surface. When the bombing finally ceased, only the stench of gunpowder, the sickening mix of bodies and mud, and a strange, suffocating silence remained, as if the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. Those of us still alive crawled out of our holes, staggering, dazed. I was one of the first to stand. I needed to see who had made it. I walked through the trench, stepping on things I didn't want to think about. Whether it was mud or flesh, I didn't care to know. I passed by the surviving men, searching for those who hadn't been so lucky. That was my job that morning. Count the ones who remained and bury the ones who didn't. But then I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Footprints. It wasn't unusual to see tracks in the mud, but these were too fresh, too clear, as if someone had just walked through seconds ago. But what truly sent a chill down my spine was the direction they were headed, straight toward the abandoned shack just beyond the trench. That shack had been empty for days. None of our men went near it because the structure was falling apart, barely standing. If someone had walked through, I would have seen them. But the prints were there, deep, distinct, left behind while the mud was still wet. Adrenaline still coursed through me, so my first thought was an enemy. A lost German soldier? A deserter? I gripped my rifle and followed the tracks. With every step, the air felt heavier. The shack seemed darker than it should have, even with the morning light creeping in. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe a soldier was seeking shelter. Maybe someone was wounded, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. When I reached the door, the smell hit me first. A foul, damp stench. Rotting wood mixed with something else, something sickly sweet and decayed. I swallowed hard and pressed my hand against the door, pushing it open slowly. And what I saw inside made my blood turn to ice. In that moment I knew. Something I couldn't explain was watching us. The shack was small, built from rotting wooden planks. The roof sagged, the beams barely holding, and moisture seeped through the cracks like cold sweat. But it wasn't the appearance that unsettled me. It was the feeling. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew heavier, like it had been trapped there for years, unmoving, frozen in time. The silence was thick, suffocating, not just quiet but unnatural, like the outside world didn't exist beyond those walls. My eyes took a second to adjust to the darkness. The smell was worse than outside. Wet wood, mold, and something else. Something almost too sweet, almost rotten. And then I saw it, a pile of supplies in the corner. Ration sacks, canned food, bottles of water. There were even medical kits, some still sealed. The problem? These supplies had been missing for days. They weren't ours. At least they weren't supposed to be. Some crates were marked with the British Army insignia, but others looked French, even German. How the hell did they get here? I crouched and touched one of the sacks. Dry. Recent. Someone had brought this here not long ago. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. Nothing about this was right. This wasn't just an abandoned shack. Something was watching, waiting. Then I noticed something else. There were no footprints inside. None. Not even mine. The dirt floor should have shown my tracks, the mud still clinging to my boots. But the ground was smooth, untouched. My heart pounded. I turned toward the open doorway, expecting to see someone. Nothing. I listened, held my breath, not a sound, except a noise. Faint, almost impossible to hear. A whisper. I couldn't understand the words, but the feeling was clear. I wasn't alone. I stumbled out of the shack, barely catching my balance. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air outside felt fresher, but the chill in my spine hadn't left. I tried to pull myself together. I needed to tell the others about the supplies. About what I saw, or rather what I didn't see, inside. But when I looked down, my stomach twisted. The footprints were gone. Just gone. I stopped in the middle of the mud, staring at the ground where, just minutes ago, there had been a clear trail leading to the shack. Now the earth was smooth, untouched, as if no one had ever walked there, as if none of it had happened. A shiver ran down my spine. No, this wasn't possible. I turned back toward the trenches, a heavy knot forming in my throat. The moment I arrived, I pulled some of the men aside and told them everything. The footprints, the supplies, the clean ground. They laughed. "I think the lieutenant needs some sleep," one of them said, slapping my shoulder. "Or maybe the German rats are hoarding supplies now," another joked. I wanted to be angry, but deep down I couldn't blame them. It did sound ridiculous. If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. But Carter didn't laugh. He was one of the older soldiers in our unit, the kind of man who looked like he'd lived through more than his scars let on. Always quiet, always watching. When the others walked away, he pulled me aside. "Did you see anything in there?" he asked, his voice dead serious. I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain it. But then he said something that froze my blood. "You're not the first to see those footprints." I stared at him, waiting for him to continue. "Some of the men who were stationed here before us, they said the same thing. Footprints in the mud leading to that shack. But no one ever saw who made them, and they always disappeared." "And the supplies?" I asked. He was quiet for a long second. Then he took a slow breath and said, "Some things are better left alone." Then he walked away, leaving me standing there, alone, with the terrible feeling that I had just stepped into something far bigger than I could understand. I should have let it go, closed my eyes and forgotten, pretended I never saw anything, but it was eating me alive. Carter knew more than he was saying. He hadn't looked surprised when I told him what I saw. He had heard this story before. That's why later that afternoon I went back to the shack. But this time I wasn't alone. "If you already know what's in there, why are you coming?" I asked as we crossed the muddy ground in silence. He just took a deep breath. "Because I think you need to see something. The shack was exactly how I left it, silent, dark, still carrying that feeling that something was watching us. But Carter didn't waste time. He walked straight to a corner where the ground looked looser, like someone had already dug there before. "Help me with this." The wood creaked as we pulled up the planks, revealing a shallow hole in the dirt. Inside, a worn-out leather notebook covered in dust and moisture. A military journal. The cover was falling apart, but the pages inside were still legible. Carter flipped through them until he found what he was looking for. Then, he handed the journal to me, open to a specific page, and I read. October 13th, 1915. Something isn't right here. We lost a man last night. No one saw where he went. But this morning, fresh footprints were in the mud, leading to the abandoned shack. None of us went there. A shiver crawled up my spine, but I kept reading. October 14th, 1915. We found supplies inside the shack. Food, water, medicine. But no one knows who put them there. The sergeant ordered us not to touch anything. He said this isn't the work of the living. The handwriting became shakier on the following pages. Like the soldier writing it was getting more afraid with each entry. October 16th, 1915. The footprints keep appearing. The sergeant vanished today. I don't want to stay here anymore. The final entry was short, simple. If anyone finds this, be careful with the footprints. I shut the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. Who wrote this? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. Carter. Ran a hand over his face. He looked tired. I don't know his name, he muttered. But no one ever saw him again. He just disappeared. We stood there in silence. The shack felt even darker now, as if it had absorbed the presence of all those who had passed through it before. I looked at Carter, and in his eyes I saw what wouldn't say out loud. He already knew, he always knew. And now, so did I. In war, you learn to deal with fear. But there's a kind of fear that has no explanation. A fear that sticks to your skin and never lets go. After what I found in the shack, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints, always leading to the same place, always disappearing. So when my turn for night patrol came, I was ready. The cold bit through my skin, and the fog crawled across the ground like trench smoke. The world felt dead, but something was alive out there. And then I saw him, a hooded figure moving slowly through the mist. The silhouette moved in a way that wasn't natural. It never stumbled in the mud, never hesitated, never really seemed to touch the ground. And it was heading straight for the shack. My fingers tightened around my rifle. My pulse hammered in. My ears. Someone was out there. Hey, stop right there. My voice shattered the silence. Nothing. The figure kept walking. No rush, no fear. I ran after it, the sound of my boots crushing the soaked mud beneath me. But as I got closer, it vanished. Gone. Right in front of me. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving behind only the swirling fog, as if there had never been anything there at all. I stood there, struggling to breathe, refusing to believe what I had just seen. But then I smelled it. That same strange scent from the shack. I ran back already knowing what I was going to find. The supplies were back. More food, more water, more medicine. The crates looked freshly placed, untouched, as if someone had just put them there the moment I lost sight of the figure. I returned to the trench, shaken. I told the others, hoping just this once, that someone would believe me. Silence. No one laughed. Even the most skeptical soldiers felt something was off. And then Carter spoke, saying out loud what we were all thinking. That's not the, work of a living man. Nobody answered, but nobody disagreed. After that night, no one talked about the shack anymore. No one went near it after sundown, because we all knew. If you ever saw footprints leading to that place, it was best not to follow them. After that night, the shack became forbidden ground. Nobody talked about it, but everyone avoided looking in its direction. Yet the footprints kept appearing, always fresh, always leading to the same place. And the supplies, every damn morning. They were there, but now no one dared to touch them. Tension in the trench was growing. The men were restless, sleeping less, whispering among themselves, and I knew Carter felt the same unease I did. Then on a gray morning, he came to me holding an old piece of paper. I found out what this place was before the war. I took the paper from his hands. It was a French military report dated 1914, the first year of the war. The shack had been used before. It was an outpost, Carter continued. A small group of French soldiers was stationed here, but one day, they vanished. The report said no bodies were found, no signs of a struggle, no gunfire, nothing. It was as if the soldiers had just evaporated. And there's more, Carter added, hesitating. Some records mention unexplained footprints appearing in the mud. Footprints that came from nowhere and disappeared into nowhere. My stomach turned. The French had seen the same footprints. And then they disappeared. I looked at Carter, waiting for him to tell me this was all just a coincidence. But he just took a deep breath and tucked the paper back into his pocket. History repeats itself, Lieutenant, and I think someone wants us to see it. The fog began to rise between the trenches, covering the shack like a veil. A heavy silence settled in the air. That same afternoon, more footprints appeared, but this time, they were different. They weren't leading to the shack. They were coming from it. Someone or something had walked out. This time, no one joked. No one laughed. I saw the fear on the men's faces, the same fear I felt, the fear that we were not alone. And then, one question began to hammer in my mind. Were the footprints leading us there, or were they warning us to stay away? The footprints had changed. Before, they led to the shack. Now they were coming from it. Carter and I knew we couldn't ignore this. So that morning, we decided to search the area. Something here needed an explanation. The mud was thick, heavy, dragging at our boots as we walked toward the far side of the shack, a place no one ever went. That constant feeling of being watched was unbearable, and then Carter suddenly stopped. Here. I looked where he was pointing. At first, it just looked like rain-churned dirt, but as we got closer, it became clear that someone had already dug there before. We dropped to our knees and started digging with our hands. The mud was cold, heavy, reeking of decay. My stomach churned at the stench. Then suddenly, my fingers brushed against something soft, fabric, a piece of a military uniform still bearing a faded French insignia on the chest. Carter met my gaze, silent. We both knew what we had found. We kept digging until the first bones surfaced. There were so many, a shallow grave, barely covered, and from the condition of the remains, it was clear no one had buried them with care. These soldiers were left here like they didn't matter. I pulled the diary from my pocket, flipping through the pages until I reached the last entry. My hands trembled as I read. We've been discovered. There's no more time. They won't give us a chance. We don't want to die like this. If someone ever finds this and we just wanted to go home. I shut the diary, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. They tried to desert, I murmured, but they were caught and executed. Carter nodded. And no one ever buried them properly. They were forgotten here. I stepped back from the grave, a tightness in my chest. Suddenly, everything made sense. The supplies, the footprints. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't an enemy, a vengeful ghost or a curse. It was them, the forgotten soldiers, the ones who tried to escape the war and never did. They were still here, trying to help anyone lost. Maybe leaving supplies so no one starved like they did. Maybe leaving footprints so someone would finally find them. And now, finally, someone. Had I turned to Carter. What do we do? He took a slow breath, removed his helmet, and looked at the grave. The only right thing to do. And without another word, he started digging. We worked the entire day. For the first time in years, these men were given a proper burial. That night, the footprints never returned. That night, I expected silence. I expected it all to be over, but I was wrong. The fog returned, denser than ever. The cold bit deeper. The trench was quiet, but I knew something still wasn't right. Carter was the first to call me over. He stood near the edge of the trench, his face pale. He pointed at the mud. The footprints were there again. But this time they weren't leading to the shack. They were coming from it, and they led straight to us. My whole body tensed. I moved forward slowly, as if any sudden movement would somehow erase what I was seeing. Carter followed, and together we traced the trail until we found what they had left behind. One last pile of supplies, but this time, it wasn't just food and medicine. There was a small French canteen, a rusted lighter, and an old helmet, all carefully stacked on top of the crates. This wasn't just a supply drop, it was a farewell. I stood there for a long time, just staring at those objects. They were trying to tell us something. Carter let out a slow breath beside me. I think it's over. And I knew he was right. The next morning, the footprints never returned. No fresh tracks in the mud. No sign of anything moving through the night. The shack remained there, dark and silent. But now, it felt empty. I never told my superiors. I never wrote a report about what happened. Who would believe me? And deep down I knew. This wasn't meant to be told. Some stories belong where they happened, somewhere between the living and the dead. And since that night, I've never seen footprints in the mud again. But sometimes, when the fog crawls, low, when the trench is swallowed in absolute silence, I wonder if somewhere they're still marching. War is chaos, fear, and destruction. But amid the horrors of battle, there are stories that defy all logical explanation. Are they just coincidences? Hallucinations born from stress and desperation? Or is there something beyond our understanding at work in these moments? One thing is certain. These accounts continue to intrigue and haunt those who lived through them. Now they haunt us too. What do you think? Do you believe the supernatural intervened in these soldiers' fates? Or is there a rational explanation for everything? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss new content. And if you want more mysterious stories like these, share this video with your friends and stay tuned for the next one. See you in the next video.